So shall we begin this session, which is parallel session B, moving towards inclusive assessment. So today we have two different papers, one from Simon Jarvis, another from Linda Amrane-Cooper, and they'll be both talking about inclusive assessment. So we'll start with Simon and then we'll move on to Linda, and then we'll do a sort of Q&A and discussion afterwards. So we shall begin. So first of all, I'm going to introduce Simon, who's just appeared on the screen. So Simon is Head of Student Wellbeing at Queen Mary University, where he has worked for 13 years. He has actually spent about 20 years working in student support and first became interested in the concept of inclusive practice when government cuts to funding for disabled students took effect in higher education. As someone with a background in disability support, he is very conscious of the high value students place on their examination arrangements and what they perceive as being fair. He is also chair of the University of London Worldwide's Inclusive Practice panel. So today, Simon is talking about online exams and inclusivity, the dream and the reality. So off you go, Simon.
Thanks very much, Matt. Okay, I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, hopefully you can all see that. So yeah, as you just heard, I work at Queen Mary University of London. Been there a long time. Yeah, got a long background in student support. So I've got some slides which hopefully you'll find thought-provoking, possibly entertaining, and I'm going to try and kind of get the crystal ball out a bit and try and speculate, hopefully with some degree of certainty about what the future may look like. So this slide kind of represents examinations in what you might call the before times, so pre-pandemic, and there's an image there of a hall with lots of chairs and desks, which probably for those of us that were undergraduates, or really any of us that were undergraduates, probably in the last 150 years, I imagine our exam experience looked rather like this. In putting these slides together, I did a little bit of research, and I found that kind of university exams were sort of instigated around the mid-19th century, when schools, interestingly, asked universities to create local exams for the boys where they lived. So really from in 150 years, I think exams probably changed remarkably little. Exams usually closed book, not necessarily, and nearly always timed. So we can all remember, I'm sure, the clock on the wall and the strictures about not leaving in the first 20 minutes and not the last 20 minutes. So exams there, and then thinking about my work as someone in disability support and in student support generally, really from the 1990s onwards, and particularly from the year 2001, when what was the Disability Discrimination Act finally applied to higher education, we had a requirement as a sector, a responsibility to provide students with reasonable adjustments, and a critical one, and one that students clamour for is extra time exams usually. Arguably the Equality Act in 2010 sort of extended this to other protected characteristics. So for example, we regularly provide exam arrangements for pregnant students now. The image 25% is there because that's kind of become the default de facto amount of extra time that most students have. But as the years have gone on and kind of with widened participation to more and more students, we have a real proliferation of exam arrangements. So we have computers used, lots of students ask for a separate room or certainly a smaller room. And this has turned into kind of a small industry, really. Most universities of any size will have hundreds, if not thousands, of students with exam arrangements. And registry departments who typically have to sort all this out. It's a huge piece of work for them, as well as disability services. And also the schools, the departments, the institutes, whatever nomenclature you use, who actually run, who write exams and have to make sure all of these things are factored in. So up until March 2020, you kind of had all your students in the sports hall taking their exams as was always the case. And then, yeah, increasingly ever-growing numbers of students with separate arrangements. Enter the pandemic. There's a nice little image there of the SARS-CoV-2 virus under a microscope. So when we went into lockdown, I think it's fair to say the sector reacted with agility, impressive agility, the kind of agility we're not necessarily known for actually as a group of people, to move assessments online. I suppose when lockdown took place, it was towards the end of the academic year, and it focused minds quite sharply really on the need to move assessment online virtually overnight. And for the students, that meant they were suddenly confronted with a brand new reality of taking their exams at home, almost certainly on their own computer, and often with hours and hours of time to complete their assessments. So, you know, we know that in a lot of cases, students had 24 or even 48 hours to complete their exam papers, which are scheduled or designed to take far less than that, usually 3 hours or perhaps even less. And we're a sort of a year on into the pandemic. March 2020 was a long time ago. So we can reflect back and we have data on what happened last year. And we know that there was a general uplift in exam results and degree classifications in the academic year 1920, and that this was, you know, at least partly attributable to the contingency measures, to those arrangements that we just touched on. There's been a rise in good honours students at Queen Mary, where I work, and speaking to colleagues and counterparts at other Russell Group universities, this is something that's fairly common. Arguably a good thing. I know grade inflation spooks people, but you would argue that in the middle of a pandemic, students doing better is probably a positive. There's a quote there from the external panel member of our Education Quality Standards Board at Queen Mary, and she said that as with most other institutions, there'd been an increase in good honours and that those outcomes were appropriate, but that we may need to defend them from queries from external agencies like the Office for Students. So that's our experience as an institution, and I'm sure colleagues can kind of empathise with this. Students getting better exam results, good honours increasing. What about the students? So this is inevitably anecdotal, but again, it's taken not just from my experience, but from looking at the student survey that we run at Queen Mary each year, as well as talking to counterparts elsewhere. And I think I can say initially students were very accepting of this new normal. That was a phrase we used last year. So students were happy to take their exams at home with 24 hours. But I think things have changed since the start of this academic year. So we know, we can testify that many more students now aren't satisfied with 24 hours or 48 hours. They want their extra time, if they're entitled to extra time ordinarily, on top of that. And we hear instances of students spending literally 24 hours in front of their computer and then saying that they couldn't finish. And that's happening at many different universities, quite often with law departments, there seem to be particularly prone to this. We also know, again, we can testify, people working at different institutions, we know there's been a rise in cheating. So the image here, I typed in online exams and this is what came up, a drop-down list, and there's online exams cheating COVID, online exam cheating detection, online exam cheating tricks. And we know the rise of these existence of these essay mills and using tools such as Turnitin. We can categorically point to cheating effectively on an alarming level in some areas. And as such, as a sector, we're anxious that we need to work towards digital integrity, academic standards being critical. If we don't have academic standards, arguably, we may as well give up and go home. So if I can just go back pre-pandemic, leap back in time, we talk about inclusive practice now as if everyone should know what it is and as if it's existed for forever, and it hasn't. But the Higher Education Academy published some work on this as long ago as 2010, so 11 years ago. And this quote from May and Bridger is a useful definition, I think. So inclusive practice, excuse me, I'm going to read this. Inclusive practice necessitates a shift away from supporting specific student groups through a discrete set of policies or time-bound interventions towards equity considerations being embedded within all functions of institutions and treating that as an ongoing process. And then it makes the point there that this requires systemic change and cultural shift, which arguably the pandemic's helped with. And as Matt said in the intro, I think a lot of us got involved with this agenda from 2014 onwards when the cuts to the disabled students allowance were announced, because for the first time, particularly with disabled students, the government were kind of saying to higher education, what are you doing to embed good practice, for these students that you've had a legal requirement to support since 2001. So this is a slide of Leon Trotsky, and Trotsky famously said that war was a locomotive of history. I was using this slide quite a lot around this time last year doing presentations looking ahead to the academic year we're in. And I posited the question, would COVID-19 become the locomotive of inclusivity? So, well, is that a yes, is it a no? I mean, we know many assessments are now delivered untimed. Not all of them, but yeah, it's working at my institution. Many of the schools have stuck with untimed exams. And when I say untimed, I mean 24 hours or more. Online assessments increasingly look like being the norm, at least for some academic disciplines. There's a focus on ensuring online assessments are accessible to all the students that take them, thinking about, the browsers, the tools, the platforms that we have to utilise. And I think it's fair to say the pandemic has instigated and necessitated a review of how a lot of degree programmes are assessed. But I don't think we've necessarily reached an inclusive nirvana, and we've certainly not reached the end of this agenda. So how can you make assessment inclusive and academically rigorous? So in true undergraduate fashion, I'm going to plagiarise here from a toolkit from York St John that I particularly like, which was actually produced a few years ago, from 2017. So I've highlighted what I think are the key points here, which is offering students a range of approaches, utilising appropriate and balanced methods to assess learning outcomes, offering a choice of assessment, giving students clear information on assessment methodologies used and marking schemes, timely information on assessment, and regular formative assessment opportunities. We know students benefit from practicing. So these are some ideas of how we can make assessment as inclusive as possible. Again, inclusive for everybody, not just accessible. So I wanted to do a slide about online proctoring, because if I go to this slide about have we solved this, have we reached an inclusive Shangri-La, if you like? No, I don't think we have. There are more problems now that we wouldn't have encountered before. And an emerging one is online proctoring. So there are certain academic disciplines, and medicine's a really good example, where academic integrity is important. And I spoke to our head of assessment at Queen Mary in the medical school. And this is the only school at the moment where I work that have introduced online proctoring. It relies on restricted web browsers, so they can't just students can't use a browser of their own choice. They need two devices. They need a laptop or a computer, and then usually a smartphone to scan around the room before, during and after the exam to make sure there isn't anybody else there. They have to sweep under the table and on the ceiling and take everything off the walls, strip the walls down. Students are allowed a 2-minute toilet break per hour. And if there are discrepancies in those hourly breaks, that's recorded. As I said, phones are used to show the invigilator the room, and students are required to share their screen with an invigilator. And if they can't do that, the assessment doesn't go ahead. A nice image there of a creepy eye. So this does feel quite draconian, and doing a bit of research, I think a few people have made the point that there's a potential tension legally here between data protection effectively and students' privacy and our desire to maintain academic standards. So I don't think this is an issue that's going to go away. If we're going to have online exams and we're going to have online proctoring, this is potentially very, it's just the start of a potentially quite eggy process, because, as I say, I think it is open to legal challenge. And there's a link there to a article that was republished actually by Wonky from an academic, and effectively saying we don't need proctoring as a sector. Academia doesn't need proctoring. We need to review assessments. I'm sure that's true in some disciplines. As I say, I'm not convinced it's necessarily true for every discipline. So I think this is a new problem we wouldn't have had, 2 years ago, 18 months ago. So what will the future be like? And this is, Mystic Meg time, I suppose. It's a nice slide here. When I was talking to Linda a couple of weeks ago, she used this phrase, which I love: we can't put the toothpaste back in the tube. So there are certain things we've done now that I don't think we can row back on. Online exams probably are here to stay. And the pandemic has probably turbocharged an existing agenda. If you think of that Trotsky slide about, the locomotive of inclusivity, it certainly sped things up. Untimed exams may well continue in certain, possibly most disciplines. reflecting on my institution, our Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences are almost all using untimed exams for the next academic year. But yeah, we've got concerns about digital integrity and academic standards, which are unlikely to dissipate. And the challenge could be to review the way that we assess students. And I've got a final slide for questions, but obviously Linda's going to take over now.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you, Simon. So we're going to move directly on to Linda and Amadeep with their presentation, and then we'll have questions and discussion afterwards. So I think everyone here probably will know Linda, or will have seen Linda through the last day or and a half. But Linda is head of the University of London Centre for Distance Education, CDE. She leads a team that supports the development of expertise in the field of distance education, providing a focus for the development of high quality teaching and research in open and distance learning. She is also the senior leadership or part of the senior leadership team as Director of Strategic Projects and leads the University of London PG Learning and Teaching in HE programme. Amardeep Sanghera works in the Surveys and Student Voice team in University of London Worldwide. His work involves working on student surveys, including on design and analysis, and he is Assistant Secretary to the Student Voice Group. Amardeep also played a central role in the recruitment of student fellows for the CDE. So today they're going to be talking about inclusive practice, learning from our students. So over to you.
Thanks very much, Matt, and thanks, Simon, for that very stimulating provocation. Really, you know, it raises so many questions, doesn't it? And it is an exciting time to see that this toothpaste really probably is out of the tube, but we certainly know there's a few challenges and some areas that we need to support. So what we wanted to do in this session, Amadeep and I, is really share some of the findings from the bigger evaluation that we talked about in the keynote session. And Amadeep, if you'll just pop to the next slide for me. Thank you for operating the slides. Okay, so as I said if you weren't at the keynote, you won't know, but I said there that we had about 38,000 students who were due to take exams when we went into lockdown in March 2020. They were due to take you know, traditional pen and paper exams in an exam hall in a local examination centre across the world. There's about 600 or 700 exam centres local to them. And we had to move all of that online, as everybody else did, and that agility that Simon mentioned was, you know, part of what we did. So the exams finished at the end of August, and we initiated a big investigation or evaluation of the whole process. And what we're going to focus on here is specifically students who would normally request adapted or special arrangements for their examinations. So we're only talking about what would have been timed examinations in an exam hall, when we're particularly focusing on those students who would have had special adaptations to that. And Simon prefaced that quite nicely for us earlier. If we pop to the next slide, Amadeep, that would be great. I think I'm handing over to, oh no, I'm carrying on for a bit more. So just to say, we looked at these different areas, and for the group of students that we're talking about, we gathered data on all of these areas. But I think we're going to particularly focus on student sentiment and what our students said to us about the experience, and what the implications were then for us in preparing for this summer's examination, and in thinking about where we go in the future and how we move forward. Next slide, please. So just to provide a little bit of background, here's some of the various descriptions that the students gave us as to why they might have sought special or adaptations to their exam experience. So you'll see a whole variety of different issues and conditions there, as one would expect, but also I think it's important to note that we are serving the needs of military personnel, often in difficult locations or travelling. We're also quite a significant number of students who are in prison. And of course, Nelson Mandela was one of our students who studied with us a while ago. So, you know, we've got a history of supporting prison education. So these are the sort of folks who would have particular adaptations to their exams. Over to you, Amardeep, just to start digging into some of that data.
Thank you, Linda. Good afternoon, everybody. I'll highlight some of the differences in sentiment between the 8,500 survey respondents who are represented in blue and the 127 people who noted they normally request special access arrangements who are represented in orange. Given the relatively small sample size of the people who normally request special access arrangements, we need to be careful when comparing these percentages. There's some possible evidence that this subsample were a bit less satisfied with the process of asking questions and getting queries resolved. Also, they are about as satisfied with the online activity assessment itself. But interestingly, this subsample appeared to be significantly more likely to say they would like to see online assessment continue in the future, 81% versus 66%, which is the bar chart on the right-hand side, the last statement. On this slide, we have comments from 3 students. The reasons I chose these comments is because the students draw upon their own experience, with one student mentioning their disability and another student who mentioned their special access arrangement they had previously had when sitting examinations. I would like to start with the comment in the middle, with the student who mentioned they have rheumatoid arthritis. This student also mentioned that they are slow typer and that they will like 24 hours to complete the examination at home, which would be more manageable to them. The second comment on the left is a student who mentions motor neuron disorders and how this can affect typing. They have suggested that students could be put for a speed typing test. And again, this student mentions how students with motor neuron could be disadvantaged in a time constraint setting. The last comment refers to a student who uses a scribe, which is on the right-hand side. This student states that they were really nervous during the examinations and they believe their performance was affected as their scribe could not help them type the answers. Again, the student also mentions the time duration. In this slide, we addressed a question about the future of assessment. The survey included the following question: based on your experience this year, which of the following statements most closely reflect your current view about how you would like to be assessed in the future? I would prefer to be assessed by, and then we have a number of statements. The chart in front of you, the chart you have in front of you gives the result for the global sample of 8,500. What is interesting to hear is that just over half of the respondents prefer to be assessed at home using their personal device. But this response option was particularly popular among students who say they usually select special access requirements, with just under 2/3 saying that this would be the preferred option in the future. I now have some open text comments. From some students regarding the future of assessment. The reason I chose these comments is because the students make an interesting point. The students speak about the benefits as well as the challenges. The first comment is by a student who mentions the university should make stricter regulations for online assessment. They would prefer to be examined online in the future, as well as the possibility of examined twice a year. The second comment comes from a student who also has small children, and online assessment was very beneficial to them. This form of assessment worked particularly well, and they would like to see it continue.
Amadeus, just to say, we can't see those student comments. They're not showing up, I don't think. Oh, there we are. Brilliant. Yeah. Thank you.
Sorry, I'll just repeat the second comment. The second comment comes from a student who also has small children, and online assessment was very beneficial for them. This form of assessment worked particularly well, and they would like to see it continue. The last quote notes positive in both location and the timing aspects of online assessment. You can see that majority of students in this subsample would like to see online assessment continue in the future, but there were clearly students who it posed a challenge to, and it would be interesting to address their needs in the future. Thank you for listening. I'll now hand back to Linda for the final 2 slides of my presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Amadeep. So I think what we've illustrated there is that it was a mixed experience for all of our students, of course, but it was a mixed experience for our students who would normally have adaptations to their exam experience. So what we're seeing there is that for the, being at home, being able to work in a longer pace, for example, on the 24-hour papers, was generally positive for a lot of people. But the challenge of typing was definitely an issue, not just for students who would normally have adaptations, but thinking about our student population who are drawn from over 200 countries across the globe. Having a keyboard that's configured to type in English, may not be the case, etc. So there was definitely opportunities for us to enhance the provision and the support. So I've got there really what I feel is that we need to make sure that we are bringing together consideration of assessment design, assessment delivery, our accountability and responsibility to all of our students, and developing some training. So it was really useful that Simon mentioned May and Bridger, and it being about equity, not just about time-bound interventions. So one of the things, as I said, in relation to typing, for example, is we've produced a short course to help students to understand how to use text-to-speech and speech-to-text software, and also how to use a variety of tools to organise their notes and so on when they're about to engage with their assessment. We also gave quite a lot of training and resource that we developed over the last year in relation to academic integrity. So helping students to understand things like how we're going to use Turnitin or text matching software and what the implications are for them when they submit their assignment. Word counts, those kind of factors were brought in. Supporting students to understand that a 24-hour exam doesn't mean you're writing for 24 hours, but you do have the opportunity to spread your time out across those 24 hours. But I think really importantly are these questions of assessment delivery, and there Simon's already picked up on the issue of proctoring and the challenges around proctoring, and that was certainly the case from the feedback from the students who were involved in that, who had some proctoring, the kind of comments, the equipment needs, the broadband needs in order for proctoring to work effectively, and remembering that a large proportion of our students are in countries where there's not particularly robust broadband for everybody. So this was definitely an issue around delivery, and we need to continue to consider how we are actually delivering our assessments. And then I think there are these very important questions around assessment design, or assessment design for authenticity, for relevance, for engagement, assessment that supports learning and takes learning forward, and assessment that helps with integrity issues. I was thinking in relation to one of the things that Simon mentioned, and I'd like actually if the audience as well as Simon at some point can discuss this, and it's the question of when an exam stops being an exam. Because if it's an open book and if it's over a period of time, 48 hours, when does it stop being an exam and become coursework? Just wondering what institutions are doing about that. So those are some of the implications, I think, that for us, that we've got to get these cogs working properly, our accountability, our responsibility, our accountability to our students in terms of duty of care, our accountability to the regulators, to OFS, to the professional bodies that we run our programs in relation to, the needs for training for our students training for the teams who work with our students and support them, the professional services staff, and also training for the academics and the learning designers who are creating the assessments. And bringing together that assessment delivery and assessment design consideration. Just because it's online, just because it's timed, doesn't mean it's a successful assessment. So what have we done since? Amadeep, if you just pop us along to the next slide, please. So we've done some things, absolutely. We've improved the accessibility of the VLE and the usefulness of the VLE. We've thought carefully about students uploading handwritten work in comparison to typed work. We've produced resources. We really have taken, as much as we possibly can, a critical review of assessment, of examinations, integrity, authenticity, etc. And we've really engaged in student voice, and that was one of the things that we wanted to try and demonstrate here. But there is no doubt that for us, and I suspect it's true across the sector, this is still very much a work in progress. It's an exciting work in progress because it does offer some tremendous opportunities. We know for the University of London that more of our students globally were able to engage with assessment, and we know also that those students were able to demonstrate their learning, and that for the majority of our students who would have previously had special exam arrangements, that we met their need. But there were some students who didn't take forward their assessments last summer because of the challenges presented, both with the pandemic backdrop, but also with the circumstances that impacted them. For example, we couldn't have human helpers who would usually be involved as scribes, for example, in our assessments. I think I'll stop there and open up for a conversation with the audience and with Simon and Amadeep, if I may. Thank you very much.
Brilliant, thank you, thank you, Anna, Linda, and Amadeep. That's brilliant, thank you, and Simon on your previous talk as well. They were really insightful, I think, on the challenges that we all share with assessment, especially, and challenges that students in particular have. We've got one or two questions sort of popped up, but I'm just going to start with one that sort of question that always comes up, I'm afraid, when it comes to assessment. But has there been a sort of difference in student feedback and opinion about, especially proctoring, but online assessment in general, when it comes to new students versus students who had previously studied in the older system? So those who had actually done face-to-face in classroom assessment before, did they make any sort of specific comments on what they liked and what they didn't like in comparison?
I'll go, because yeah, I can think of a few things. Mixed bag, really, as you might expect. So some students liked it, some students did not like it. I think some students found the time particularly really overwhelming. So they kind of prefer to go back to how things were, with a much sort of more prescriptive timeframes. So you know, almost giving them so much time to procrastinate that they felt that they'd done worse. But there was that's a really good point about new students versus students who've been here before. So yeah, perhaps unsurprisingly, first year students this year, they've not known any other way of being assessed at university. So the issues that have come up about perceived fairness have been from, returning students or second years, etc. But it really, there's so much variation really between academic disciplines.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, Simon. At the point we did our survey last summer, we asked them, what would you like to see in the future? And we gave them some options, and it was on the slides that Amardeep shared. And at that point, their first choice was online assessment in their own home. So the format that they took last summer and that they've taken this summer. But actually the second choice out of that list that scored the second highest was to go back to the old system of unseen examinations in an exam hall. So at that point, that was the data. Now we're just about to send out our survey for this summer, and that question will be on there. And my feeling is that everybody has shifted on that. I don't think we're going to see students having as their second choice exam halls, but I might be wrong. I'm certainly happy to kind of come back and report on that. So it will be interesting to see. So I suspect that, you know, those who had experience of exam halls, and of course, most of us have kind of grown up, as Simon suggested, you know, we've grown up going into the sports hall to sit at a rickety table to write, you know, pen and paper for 2 or 3 hours. That's the kind of training that we'd had. And that was one of the things that the students were saying to us. That was the format that they had prepared for last summer. The format that they're prepared for this summer, of course, isn't that. They are prepared for those longer times. They are prepared for the open book. So they're in a much better position, I think, to engage. So it will be interesting to see what the exam outcomes are like. Certainly last year we saw an uplift as across the sector. We saw an uplift in sort of average module marks, and we saw an uplift in good degrees of 2-1s and firsts. Reflecting the sector. It will be interesting to see if that uplift continues from there, if we keep going up, or what will happen actually.
Yeah, so our medical school have started to reopen they've basically started to offer students exam rooms on campus again, and that has proved really popular. As I said earlier, I mean, they're obviously, I wouldn't say it's unique, but it's unusual. But particularly for those, if we're talking about inclusivity, so particularly for those students that might live in, you know, with lots of other family members that might not have their own bedroom because they share that with a sibling, having a room on campus they can come into is very, very attractive. And I guess it depends what kind of institution you have, but I imagine for lots of us, there'll be many students in that situation that would prefer to, frankly, use a room on campus because it's a much more conducive environment for them to work in. Couldn't do that a year ago, it probably would have been illegal, but we can now. So yeah, just wanted to be mindful of that.
Yeah, that's an interesting point in itself, and sort of going forward, how would universities sort of provide those sort of rooms en masse potentially if a lot of students actually required them, when that's potentially something more to consider. So that's potentially issue going forward, I would guess.
Yeah, I mean, universities aren't built to have lots of very small cellular offices, are they? They're built with big lecture theatres, big laboratories. So it is a definite challenge. Queen Mary, I don't think this is actually official, but it's true. We've kind of made the decision that academic year 21-22, the exams will be online almost everywhere again. But I imagine we are going to have many more students that ask for that kind of provision, really. So yeah, it's not an easy thing to find lots of small rooms, basically.
Different kind of challenges that might come up from this, admittedly. David Bourne has just put a sort of an interesting kind of question. So not everyone can type or even use voice recognition. How about handwriting? Then the students scanning for photoing and uploading their answers. I think that is something that you did mention as something that sometimes does happen, but that kind of brings up to my mind, so we're potentially entering a time where we're going to have kind of multiple ways for students to engage with their assessments. So in some cases, they might have to handwrite, they might have to scan the document, they might be typing. How are universities, do you think, going to handle that kind of complication and make sure that it's fair when when you're marking something that's handwritten compared to something that's typed? It's quite a different thing to actually mark. How do you make that fair?
Yeah, that's really interesting, Matt. And that was one of the things that came out of last summer, big time. So first of all, from the student point of view, we gave them the option to handwrite and scan it or photograph it and upload it. That was sometimes quite complicated, as students might have to do page by page and upload that. And if they've written a lot or there are a lot of questions, that's a lot of uploading. And the system being stable, being able to get that there, it all going to their name, etc., anonymously, but allocated to them. We also needed, of course, in some papers for students to do that. If they were writing mathematical symbols, we had ancient Greek papers where people had to write by hand. because of the symbols and so on. So that was absolutely the case. And then students also chose to handwrite regardless of the subject as well, and uploaded. This year we've tried to cut back on that, because actually we found that most people were happy to type, and a lot of students gave us feedback that they were delighted to type. It was a much more natural way of working because they're not used to handwriting anymore, and I can relate to that. And their handwriting, they don't feel particularly comfortable, and they can also edit. You know, once you've written it, you've got to cross it out and write it again and so on, but they could edit properly with the typing option. And the examiners gave a resounding thumbs up to typewritten stuff, because it was much easier for them to engage with. But picking up on David's point about not being able to write or use speech-to-text software, then we do absolutely have other supports for students. So we have in-person support. So and we use Zoom and Teams connections for that, to allow the student and their support person to be able to work together. But you know, that was sort of challenging to get that off the ground at the beginning, but now it's pretty well established. So those kind of adaptations, absolutely. And again, that's where the longer time, I think, helps with that, or the move to more lower stake assessment, where the final assessment is not the only assessment that's happening, that they're, you know, they might only be taking 40% of their final assessment. That, I think, all helps in those circumstances.
I liked your question, Linda. When is an exam not an exam? Because that does feel like where we're heading, isn't it? At what point do we stop using that word? And actually, if we do stop using that word, how does that impact on students' perception? Because some of those problems I've been alluding to with procrastination and, yeah, like spending way too much time, arguably, you might be able to get away from that if you use different terminology. But what you would call them is a very, yeah, not one I'd like to answer really, but yeah, exam means something very fixed in people's minds, I think. It's true.
It does, but actually we already had a really wide range of exam practices before we went into it. So, you know, scene papers, papers where they used resource, you know, not completely open book, but resourced papers in an exam hall. So we had already had some of that practice established, so it wasn't too difficult to move in some subjects to that. But I think it does give us the opportunity. We actually called ours online timed assessments rather than exams.
That's what it says on the tin, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Simon, you've in the chat, you sort of talked about word counts, or you asked a question about word counts and if others are using them or not, and that students could find them stressful. Would you like to talk about that a little bit more?
Yeah, sure. So earlier at the start of the academic year, I think, you know, myself, counterparts at other institutions were talking about, you know, how much work some students had been able to create in 24 hours. There's obviously a real burden on staff there. I mean, effectively, if someone's written War and Peace, someone's going to have to read it. So one strategy some institutions have used, and I definitely know King's have done this, is to restrict the amount you can write. You bring in a word count, which initially I thought, well, that's a very elegant solution. But yeah, as I said in the chat, really, I don't think it's without controversy, because, you know, students report they find that stressful. So, you know, you've got a day to do the exam, but you can only write, I don't know, 3,000 words, and they found that challenging. I suppose if you go back to learning outcomes, if you make it clear that one of the learning outcomes of the assessment is to write concisely, I would argue that's valid. But yeah, I was curious really just to see if anyone else had that experience, because it's not something we've gone down the path of at Queen Mary, and I'm aware that a few institutions have done it, but I was just curious to know if anyone had any kind of experiences there. But yeah, effectively that was what the question was about.
University of London, because we've got the member institutions having the academic direction, you know, it's a very interesting place to be, because you've got you know, Birkbeck, Queen Mary, King's, UCL, all of the member institutions, SOAS, etc., determining some of these academic decisions. So in fact, we have word counts in some of our exams, and that's to pick up on the point you make, Simon, about, you know, somebody having 24 hours. Are they going to write War and Peace as a response to that? But other program teams were very, very adamant that they didn't want word counts. For example, creative writing, you know, it wouldn't necessarily make any sense to limit on the word count there. But I was thinking that, again, this question about when is an exam not an exam, because of course in coursework you usually have word counts, and students get stressed about word counts. I mean, my students at the moment are writing an assignment and they don't feel they've got enough words to fit in, and I'm saying you do. And so I think that that's, you know, that's a common challenge, isn't it, in terms of word counts. And again, it's about training, isn't it? It's about what's the preparation that students need in order to be able to write to a question within the word count. And that's quite a different set of skills to going into an exam paper and writing everything you've ever learned about something because you want to get it into your exam. But you've only got 2 hours in there, so there's a limit to how much you can do. So it is a very different approach, I think. And this is the bit that I'm particularly concerned about, is understanding how we need to support students to develop exam behaviours. At the moment, you know, most students are coming from a background of having sat in paper exams, and they've learnt you put your bag at the front, and you've got to bring your ID, and you've got to time yourself out, and you need to have a drop of water and all of those things. And they've built that experience up over time. They've built strategies, mostly have built strategies to deal with the stresses of that and to prepare themselves for that. Now we're setting them into a different environment, and it's not clear that we've yet kind of got the support right, or the training right, or even understand all the implications ourselves of what it means, I think.
Yeah, and I definitely agree that sort of the training sort of lead into this is what's probably going to become crucial, sort of how we train and sort of support the student through the program itself to the exam. And maybe we need to emphasize that the kind of word counts and sort of being quick and efficient with your writing much more than we have in the past sometimes. Yeah. I've got just a quick from one attendee just saying exams are about performance in a few hours, which was sort of related to that conversation, which I suppose is a definition of exams, which maybe is not what we're talking about now. So maybe we do need to rethink our terminology somewhat. David has put in another question. Do we expect that this process of reinventing assessment will continue over a few years? Or have we already got to a new normal in assessment methods? I don't know what you think about that.
So I think, as I said in the slides, really, I think there was increasingly, before the pandemic, a sort of a movement to query and to review the way we assess, and what the pandemic's done is kind of exacerbated that. That's not the right word. Just sped the whole thing up. So I think where people were being invited to do that, all of a sudden it became a necessity. But I think it's almost like opening Pandora's box. So now we've done it. Now we've reviewed assessment. I think it will continue to change. I don't think we've kind of reviewed it and that bit's done and now we're happy. I think we're probably going to be going through in the short to medium term another kind of round of change. I think in a few years' time, assessment will probably look quite different to what it looks like now. So I think we're still in the throes of it all, really.
I think I'd agree completely as well. You know, one of the, and Simon, I think you mentioned this about law students. I mean, one of our largest programs is our undergraduate law provision, where we've got about 17,000 students studying undergraduate laws at the University of London. And, you know, the regulatory bodies there are, and the national regulatory bodies where our degrees are recognised, for example, in Pakistan and Bangladesh, you know, they have particular perspectives on how assessment should be, and you know, by and large the gold standard is the sort of fixed time, unseen written examination under examination conditions. But so they you know, then we're now facing our second year of not doing that, but of having online assessment, and that is going to be changing. So as we make changes, it's going to have an impact on the regulatory bodies, and the regulatory bodies are similarly going to be changing their understandings and their expectations around that. So I think inevitably it is a complex system in which we work, and we will have to keep making adaptations. But if we think about particularly this group of students that I was talking about, which are the students who would normally have exam adjustments of one, or adaptations of one kind or another, then I think we really do have to keep considering how we're going to meet those students' needs in particular, and the ways in which we can support them. And we've seen, you know, from what Amardeep shared with us, you know, the ways in which we have supported students, but also the ways in which other students have not had as much access as we would like them to. Amardeep, I don't know if you wanted to come in or...
No, Linda, I don't have any further comments to make. No, just, you know, so yeah, our presentation, you know, we included a lot of information about the students who, you know, made special access arrangements, and, you know, what they had to say. But no further comments from me.
Thank you.
I mean, one development could be that we make much more transparent. So if we get away from inclusivity and think about the needs of individual students, one thing we could do is make it much more transparent for students to ask for alternative assessments, which actually is something we've been supposed to be doing as a sector for quite some time, but because it's a lot of work, nobody's really wanted to embrace it. But that might be one development. So we have a far more student-friendly process for those students, a bit like in David's question, really, who can't write by hand, or they can't type because of a very complex physical disability. Then hitherto, this point is probably been quite difficult for them to ask for different assessments. They wouldn't know how to, or they wouldn't know what the process was. So that might be a development that kind of captures the needs of those particular students. You know, those students with very profound sort of needs that wouldn't be, you know, met by some of the inclusivity stuff that we've been talking about.
Right, thank you. Oh, sorry, Linda.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. But I was also thinking about the kind of the wider inclusive agenda as well, in terms of you know, performance of students from different groups. For example, you know, we've got data in the UK that suggests different ethnicity has an impact on potential outcomes. So I think that, you know, that a root and branch analysis and look at assessment is going to start to hopefully impact quite positively on all of our students. And I think there was a comment in the questions about provision that's made for students with particular needs benefits all, and I would thoroughly agree with that.
Great, thank you. We just gained another question from Megan Argo, which will probably be our last question, I would imagine. Given the news today, sorry, it's moved off my screen, about so few students disclosing their mental health issues, it's worth thinking about online assessment as a good thing for those who suffer from anxiety and related conditions and are scared for whatever reason of disclosing it to their institution. It's not all about the physical differences. So we haven't really talked about sort of the kind of sort of the mental health sort of side of this, but is there sort of more that we could be doing, I suppose, around that in terms of assessment?
We did get data from students who mentioned sort of mental health issues, depression and anxiety were were on that list of sort of things that I had, different responses that we had. So we definitely had feedback from students where depression and anxiety had been part of the background. And I think there were two outcomes really. So some of those students were absolutely agreed that the circumstances last summer helped them to be able to engage with demonstrating their learning by taking an online assessment. But for others, for some of them, the rush last summer to making this all happen, and what was it going to be like? It was a brand new experience, was too wasn't the right situation for them, so they withdrew from their examinations. So we actually kind of got responses in both categories really. So there were some students from the whole global population, as well as the smaller population that we're looking at today, who responded to say having the exam at home was less stressful, it was better. They didn't, particularly they didn't want to travel and so on within the COVID environment. But others actually said it was more stressful because they didn't know what was going to happen. They didn't know what it was like. We had some practice sites, and a chance to kind of upload and download things, but not all students had a chance to have a look at that. So there were those kind of barriers definitely last year. What I hope is that this year, those big technical worries will have been reduced because people will be more familiar. But I think we need to be mindful as we go forward that stress and the impact on students with mental health, remains something for which we're responsible. Absolutely.
I didn't see that particular piece of news actually. I'll have to check that out. I was presenting in another conference here at Queen Mary this morning about students with mental health. It's an irony there. I mean, it's an obvious point to make, but I think generally with students, in terms of exams, the clearer you can be with them about what they're going to do, when they're going to do it, as Linda says, give them an opportunity to practice stuff, the less likely you are to have issues, with reporting sort of anxiety and then ultimately not being able to complete the exam. And I think I think to be fair, a lot of schools and institutes and academic departments do a lot of work to write things about this is what your exam will look like. Inevitably, some students don't read things. So, there's I suppose a challenge there to think about how else you could engage them. You might want to do, like a sort of a podcast, a webcast, or I know our medical school have done a series of short videos to try and tackle this kind of stuff with that in mind, really, because I think you're right, Linda, it's sort of fear of the unknown.
Well, yeah, our student experience team did a lot of podcasts, and they also did a lot of student to student, sort of student mentoring, student blogging, talking about the experience, and a huge amount of work in terms of mental health support. We've got an app, the Talk Campus app, which we actually launched just before lockdown. We didn't time it quite that way, but that's the way it turned out. And that's really helped, I think, quite a lot of students to engage with some peer-to-peer support and some wider well-being support, really.
Yeah, Megan's just thanks for that. And Megan's just said it's on 1KG, which I think I found the link to. So I'm just going to put that into the chat. So I hope that's the right one. It looked like it was. Brilliant. Okay, well, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Simon. Thank you, Linda. Thank you, Amardeep, for your talks. It was really insightful and really good questions and answers there as well. I think we've got about a 15-minute break now, and then we've got our final session of the day, and then obviously there'll be more tomorrow. Just to say thank you very much, and thank you. I'll do my own round of applause, which I'm afraid we can't do properly on this, but brilliant. So thanks
very much. Thanks, everybody.
Cheerio.
Good session. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye.